welcome to our presentation by Juan David Delgado, How Does Racial Inequality Happen? The Case of the Colombian Pacific Region in the Longue Durée, 1550 to 2020. My name is Ruben Hernandez Leon, and I'm the new director of the UCLA Latin American Institute. So for me, it's a special pleasure to welcome all of you. This is also our first seminar in a year-long series on Colombia, a country, a very important country in Latin America that the UCLA Latin American Institute had not covered very well, partly because we didn't have a working group or a center or a program on the Andes, although Colombia has also a Caribbean region as well as an Andean region. But it's actually very nice to be able to tell you that we not only have a year-long series on Colombia in place right now, and this is again the first of the series, but we also have now an Andean region working group within the UCLA Latin American Institute. I want to thank, as always, at the controls, Brian Pitts, who's the assistant director of the UCLA Latin American Institute. And I also want to take this opportunity to invite you to donate to the mission of the UCLA Latin American Institute. This is an institute that has a long established history at UCLA. It provides scholarships and support the work of graduate students throughout the disciplines. And it also has a very robust outreach program. We actually work with teachers in public schools. We develop workshops and courses for teachers. This year, we're actually taking teachers to Oaxaca, Mexico for a language, history, and culture program there. And without further ado, I want to welcome Juan David Delgado. We were having some internet issues for a moment. The gods of the internet, as I like to call them, were not with us, but apparently the problem and hopefully the problem has been solved. Juan David is a PhD in sociology here at UCLA, and he's a recent pre-doctoral fellow at UCSD. He was also with us last year, if you recall, in a seminar on Afrodescendants in Mexico. And that has to do with the fact that Juan David's dissertation, Juan David's research actually compares the experience of Afro-descendant movements in Mexico and Colombia. Today, his focus will be on Colombia. And Juan David, welcome. And very happy that we were able to solve these problems, and take it away.
Yes, I'm very happy indeed, Ruben. Ruben, thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm very grateful for having a chance to talk about my research here, and also with the UCLA Latin American Institute. So let me share my screen. Okay, great. So my talk today explores the long-term processes of racial inequality, and it focuses on the Colombian Pacific region, basically since the second half of the 16th century and on. This is very much, as I said, a work in progress, and this particular presentation belongs to a research project that emerged from my dissertation. So I'll try to be brief in order to have time for discussion during the Q&A. So let's begin with one of the puzzles of racial inequality in Latin America. As the recent survey data shows, racial disparities have persisted without official racial classification or formal spatial segregation. And here, the comparison with the US is useful because spatial segregation is one of the fundamental axes of racial inequality in the US. It is really difficult to understand all the accumulated disadvantages of people of African descent in the US without paying attention to official practices of spatial segregation, like redlining, for example. So what is interesting about racial inequality in Latin America is that it has persisted in the absence of these formal practices. So now one could argue that racial inequality doesn't need official racial segregation or official racial classification in order to persist and reproduce. But even if that is the case, we still need to explain how does the lack of de jure segregation has coexisted with de facto forms of racial exclusion. And one way to answer this puzzle is to pay attention to the mutually constitutive relationship between racialization and rurality. The argument I'm advancing here is based on the territorial legacies of colonial institutions. In this sense, I suggest that if the uneven distribution of state infrastructure share territorial boundaries with former colonial institutions, the long-term overlap of territorialized forms of inequality can reproduce racial exclusion. And as we will see, this territorial overlap not only has material consequences, but also symbolic ones. This is, of course, one single process among others that help explain patterns of ethno-racial inequality. We can think of many others, including those that are articulated in urban spaces, and there's a lot of research to be done in that area as well. In this sense, we might say that this is a sufficient but not a necessary condition for the reproduction of racial exclusion. So having these caveats in mind, let me show you 3 moments of territorial overlap of racialized exclusion. So the first configuration is the colonial distribution of mining from the 18th to the 19th century. Here, there's a territorial overlap between the subnational geography of colonial slavery and the extractive economies of the new republic. So here we have data on the colonial economy of Colombia. On the left, there is a map with major gold mining regions during the colonial rule. And on the right, there's a distribution of 2 gold mining cycles in the Viceroyalty of New Granada. When we compare these figures, we see when the production of gold using enslaved labor became territorially concentrated in the Pacific coast. During the second cycle of gold mining, starting in early 1700s, the production of gold moved from central regions like Santa Fe in Antioquia to the Pacific circuits like Chocó and Popayán. So after the 18th century, there's a disproportionate allocation of enslaved labor in the Pacific coast, in relation, of course, to the rest of the Colombian regions. And as gold mining became profitable in the Pacific coast, the number of enslaved persons also increased. In this table, we see how the enslaved population in Chocó increased from 2,000 in 1724 to more than 7,000 in 1782. And this process fairly corresponds to the English period in the transatlantic commerce. Here, we have data on the historical exports of Colombia after independence. On the left, you have a map with location of exports and activities. And on the right, there is a percentage of these activities in relation to total exports. What is interesting to observe here is how the Colombian economy was diversifying in central and northeast regions, while in the Pacific coast, mining persisted, in some places even until today. However, at the same time, as you can see in the graphic on the right, mining decreased in profitability. And during the second half of the 19th century, coffee became the export product in Colombia. And here, the comparative perspective is useful. At a time when enslaved persons were brutally exploited and killed in capital-intensive plantation economies of the Caribbean and some regions of Brazil, in Colombia, on the contrary, the extension and control of mining industries was receding. So this is a critical juncture for Black people in the Pacific Coast. On the one hand, there's a process of de facto segregation that disconnects these territories from state infrastructure and market access. And on the other hand, there's also an emerging process of autonomy, also de facto process of autonomy that opens a territorial space to develop counter-hegemonic forms of social organization. In other words, inequality-making processes of segregation coexisted in Colombia with socially autonomous processes of organization. And this takes us to the second moment, the racialized representation of Black peasants during the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. Here we will see how, at the same time that Black peasants were developing autonomous forms of social organization in the lowlands of the Pacific Coast, Colombian elites developed a racialized representation of those persons and territories. Here we have a map by Robert West, anthropologist, a geographer, cultural geographer, that shows the settlement of Black peasants after abolition in 1851. The gray areas are the former mining circuits that you remember from the prior slides. And the arrows represent vectors of colonization or settlement in the river basins of the lowlands of the Pacific Coast. This picture, taken by West himself in 1950, is a picture that will give you an idea of how the settlement of Black peasants looked like then. And you'll be surprised to see how this picture resembles pretty much the same settlements that you can see nowadays in the lowlands of the Pacific Coast. So one of the evidences of racialization of this process of Black autonomy and peasantization is the Choreographic Commission. The Choreographic Commission was a scientific project led by the Italian military Agustin Codazzi in 1850, and it was organized to provide basically a nation inventory of resources and population. And we can think of this project as a nation-making project that codified the racialized representation of people and places in Colombia. So here on the right, we have one of the drawings that the commission created to illustrate the population of Bogota. And you can see to some extent the representation that Colombian elites had of themselves, resembling the European bohemia in their practices, outfits, but also skin tones. What is interesting is how much the demographic composition of this drawing resembles the data from the last colonial census, which you can see on the left. As you can see, Tunja and Bogota at the center were places with the majority white and mestizo populations back then, and also in the drawings of the Choreographic Commission. And here you can see how the representation of people of African descent in the Pacific Coast is basically the complete opposite. Black persons are represented half naked and drinking, almost like savages, far away from the cultural practices of Bogota. Once again, this graphic representation resembles very closely the demographic representation of slaves during colonial rule. So as you can see, the Colombian state retreated materially from the Pacific Coast and at the same time expanded symbolically the racialized representation of people of African descent. The territorial overlap of extractive activities, now in decadence, not only created the material conditions to reproduce inequality, but also the symbolic conditions to extrapolate colonial representations into the national imagination after independence. And here we get to the third moment, the violent disposition of the late 20th century and early 21st century. And here we have, once again, the combination of two different processes. On the one hand, indirect rule, basically the state leaving the control and the administration of these territories to intermediaries of different kinds. And at the same time, and to some extent as a consequence of all this, we have the coercive control in the production and distribution of illegal commodities, mainly coca and gold. As you can see in this slide, this is the distribution of the railroad network in 1929. This is basically the first half of the 20th century, and you can see how Colombia is pretty much fragmented territorially. Here, once again, the comparative perspective is really useful. You can compare and contrast this with the railroad network in Mexico, for instance, and you can see how under Porfirio, the Mexican economy was very much integrated into the national territories. Of course, this is just a representation of the railroad network. I could have used the highway network, and it wouldn't be very different from the point of view of access to infrastructure in the Pacific coast. Now, part of the fragmentation that we can see of the state infrastructure is related to the indirect rule. What happened in the early 20th century was that territories that were racialized as territories of savages, as you had seen in the drawings of the Choreographic Commission, were given almost as a commodity to be disciplined to the missionary administration. This map shows the different religious missions that were controlling the education and many other forms of cultural and material infrastructures in Colombia up to 1975. It is not a coincidence that many of these territories that were given to the religious administration are now coded as indigenous or Black territories in Colombia. The lack of public infrastructure, but also the lack of provision of security became strained and very clear once the coca cultivation increased in the second half of the 1990s. As you can see here in this graph, we see the evolution of coca cultivation in the Andean region. And between Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, you can see how the production of coca in Colombia grew exponentially since the second half of the 1990s. If we take a look at the distribution of coca cultivation within Colombia, you can see how the Pacific region became an important place, both for the cultivation, but also the distribution of this illegal commodity. Of course, the majority of the cultivation didn't happen there, but it became increasingly one of the major regions in the production of coca. In this map, we have the dynamic of coca commerce, if you want, but also the routes of transportation that many illegal groups use to move this kind of commodity through the northern part of the Pacific coast. So whereas the southern part became increasingly a place of production of coca, the northern part became increasingly a place of coca distribution. If you can see the arrows well there, you will see that we have two axes. On the one hand, the yellow axis from south to north represents a route that was, for the most part, monopolized by paramilitaries to move people, arms, but also drugs from the south to the north and from the inner country to the Atlantic coast. Now, that axis was in tension and contradiction with the horizontal axis of guerrillas that were moving people, drugs from the central parts of the country to the Pacific. The nodal point there is Bojayá, which is one of the tragic examples of the confrontation between guerrillas and paramilitaries that ended up massacring people in a church. So we can see how over time the receding of the state plus the racialization now is integrated into the illegal commerce in a way that is to some extent a new coercive regime that is controlling people and places. The situation is even more complicated if we consider what is going on very recently after the peace negotiations between the government and FARC. The slide here shows the progress in implementation of the final accord. This is data from 2020 that I'm taking from a group of researchers in the US who are conducting this barometer initiative from the University of Notre Dame, showing the difference between the progress of the general implementation of the final accord and the progress in the implementation related to ethnic provisions, what is called the ethnic chapter. And as you can see here, in general, the general implementation is very low, with about 20%, but the implementation of the ethnic chapter has been completed only up to the 10%. So once again, we see here, even under this third moment, that there's a differentiating and segregating activities, orientation by the Colombian government in this region that continues the overlapping and the territorial distribution of racialized inequalities. So in summary, we have these three big moments that I think help us understand how is it that de facto forms of segregation have been reproduced over time in these rural spaces. Just to summarize, we have the colonial distribution of mining industries from the 18th to 19th century, the racialized representation of Black peasants during the second half of the 19th and the 20th century, and finally, the violent dispossession that we can see in the 20th and the early 21st century. Now, all this is to show that it is not a coincidence that when we take a look at the levels of multidimensionality poverty by municipality, this is data from 2017, we see how poverty is very much concentrated in this region, not only in this region, of course, but significantly so in the regions that were, on the one hand, colonial legacies of extractivist industries, but also the regions that were given to the Catholic missions for control in regions that are becoming and that are persisting as the rural peripheries of the Colombian state. And try to keep this map in mind, because when we analyze the percentage of Afro-descendant population by municipality, we see how when we take a look at the amount of people by municipality, there's an increasing concentration of people of African descent in the very same coastal region where all these territorial processes have been overlapping since colonial times. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juan David. As always, very concise and to the point, and we very much appreciate this. I take this moment to actually invite the members of the audience to type in their questions. We don't have actually live interaction. This is a webinar, so please type your questions via the Q&A. I think you might be able to do it through the chat, but please let's get started with the discussion. And well, there's the congratulations coming in, but excellent presentation. Thank you. I want to take a moment, taking advantage of my role here as host and moderator, Juan David, to begin asking you, can you say a little bit more about the role of the church? Because you emphasize at different points in your talk how these areas that were given to the Catholic Church or assigned to the Catholic Church are during colonial, post-colonial times are areas where you see these concentration both of sort of racialized groups and also poverty. So can you unpack a little bit more how the Catholic Church and its practices were implicated in these historical processes?
Yes, that's a really interesting question, and it sort of dovetails in one of the projects that I'm also developing. What is interesting about this institution is that, unlike many other places, like Mexico, for instance, Ruben, where secularization happened in a very specific territorial way, basically the power of the church was eventually removed from the control of state institutions or public institutions. That didn't happen in Colombia. So when we compare what Porfirio Diaz did in Mexico with what Rafael Núñez, which is sort of the Porfirian Colombian centralizer person, we can see big differences, right? The Bavarian state that to some extent Porfirio Diaz was trying to develop in Mexico was not nearly close to what Núñez, which is one of the central efforts in creating this Bavarian state. That didn't happen. So Núñez gave many of these territories, and as you know, are racialized, to Catholic missions that were not part of sort of the central core of the Catholic Church. And what is interesting here is that we have a duplicity of institutions, and many of the sort of national dynamics in terms of education, but also security provision, but also welfare, were not being given in the same way. So in Colombia, we have this cultural representation of these rural territories that for the most part can be traced back to these duplicitous institutions. Now, having said that, and sort of showing the contribution of the church to these long-term patterns of inequality, it is also interesting to trace closer to our time how in certain spaces of that religious control, there's the emergence of the liberation theology. And here we have something very similar to what happened in Central America, but also in Chiapas, for instance, in Mexico, where certain fractions or factions within the Catholic Church change the discourse in a way that contribute to organize people against this type of processes that we've been talking about. So it's really hard to do in this kind of long-term process analysis of the role of the Catholic Church, decisive judgment, but it's interesting to see how within the same institution, we have different configurations of, on the one hand, domination, if you want, and on the other hand, contention and counter-hegemonic forces.
Thank you. I'm going to start reading some of the questions which are, started to come in. Natalia Hernandez Vidal writes, thank you for a wonderful presentation. How do you see the relationship between Black and Indigenous inequality in Colombia? That's a great question.
They are very much related. And it really depends on, of course, the region. Here, I sort of focus on the Pacific Coast as a region of, that is experiencing the colonial legacies of slavery for the most part. But many of those places were also, and even until today, inhabited by indigenous groups. So in some places, like the Pacific Coast, I could have told a story of also indigenous people in the very same way. So this kind of exclusion is shared. And I think that explains, unlike other places like the US, that explains why after a century or so of these kinds of territorial exclusions, we can see how indigenous and Afro-descendant organizations are working together on similar issues, like land distribution, for instance. That, of course, having said that, that is not a national dynamic, something that we could nationalize for Colombia as a whole. Precisely because of the territorial fragmentation in Colombia, it's really hard to generalize at the national level. So the story is different when we think about indigenous people in the Amazonian region, where this kind of mutual forms of organization, but also similar forms of territorial exclusions were not shared.
Thank you. We have a question from Matias Fernandez. Hi, Matias, all the way from Chile, I understand. Thank you for connecting to this webinar. And Matias is asking, to what extent the racial inequality you're exploring is originally economic?
Well, Matias, that is a good question. And yes, I think what I try to do here is first trying to show this process of territorial allocation of enslaved labor, right? And we can think of all the racializing interpretations of that process, not only as an economic process, but also as a process that was embedded in racialized representation. But I think, from the point of view of the contemporary representation of people of African descent, and not only people, but also regions, it is interesting to see this overlap between what you might call economic processes of labor allocation during slavery, and then the nation-making process of the 19th century that was very much a symbolically racializing process. So it is a double punch, if you want. On the one hand, the state leaving this economic process that to some extent inherited from colonial times, but also expanding this very clear racializing rhetoric and language that became, part of the national imagination in Colombia.
Thank you, Juan David. Phoebe Bruce or Browse, either pronunciation is correct, hopefully. Is asking, what contemporary resistance or grassroots movements are there in Colombia that attempt to combat de facto segregation and dispossession of Black and indigenous folks?
Great question. One of the implications, I would say, of my research, when we take a look at these long-term processes, is that many of these forms of exclusion are happening in informal or de facto ways. And that means that when we think about resistance and when we think counter-hegemonic forms of organizations, to some extent, they were anti-racist without using an anti-racist language. Let me explain this. How is it that it can be anti-racism without racialism? As you can see, many of these people were abandoned to some extent by the state. So there's a lot of territorial inequality within the territory. So one of the huge forms of contention was to create collective territories for both indigenous and people of African descent. But the mobilization to defend these territories was not articulated in the anti-racist rhetoric that we're very familiar with here in the US. But if we consider the long trajectory of racialization, that is for the most part de facto racialization, we could say that the multicultural rhetoric of the 1990s that has been criticized for so many was actually going against de facto forms of racialization. So there's a very interesting research agenda to be completed on how to do anti-racism without racialism.
Thank you. We have a question here from my colleague, Professor Laura Gomez at the law school, at the UCLA Law School. Let me go ahead and read it. I would like to hear more about the choreographic commission, which I had never heard of. Amazing. I can't help thinking of the Spanish Colonial Casta Paintings. Both have a visual dimensions as self-consciously art, quote unquote, but their overwhelming role is didactic, to teach all where they belong and do not belong. Can you please comment on the legacy today in Colombia of the commission paintings? Are they well known? Is there an active critique by indigenous and Afro-Colombianos?
Yes, great question. So yes, it does resemble to some extent the Casta paintings, although of course they're from very different moments, right? The Casta paintings were drawn sort of at the end of the colonial period, and the choreographic commission was basically a national building project of Creole elites in the 19th century, and the distinction is interesting because to some extent both drawings were illustrated for different purposes. On the one hand, the colonial empire, basically at the end during the Bourbonic reforms in Mexico, they were trying to control the population, and the Casta drawings to some extent is a message from the colonial rule of basically the incapacity to control many of the ethno-racial categories and sort of crisscrosses between different kinds of people. And the infrastructures of the Spain empire at that time were very fragile, as we know. Here is different. Here in the 19th century, we have elites. They are, of course, impoverished. The infrastructures are not as strong, but this is a moment where the Creole elites are trying to implement and to build and create a nation that they could show to not only national but international audiences that they belong to the world, just like other civilized nations. So yes, these paintings had crucial consequences for the national imagination. You can ask to any Colombian, what do they think about their country? And they would say that is a country of regions. And of course, when we hear the word regions, we should think about the racialized representations of those regions. They made it to textbooks, and they made it to sort of the educational infrastructures that would represent, how people think and how do people act in Colombia in general.
Thank you. That's an excellent question, an excellent answer. Thank you for that. Always the comparative aspect sheds so much light on some of these processes. So we have a question from Cesar Castillo, who's sending kudos. Excellent, Juan. And then the question is: the implicit counterfactual that had coffee production taken off in regions with a high proportion of Black population, inequality would not be as stark? In other words, does the state recedes from the Pacific region for economic and not racial reasons? Is coffee the main reason why regions like Marmato or Caldas were not abandoned in the way the Pacific was?
Great question, Cesar. A good Colombianologo right there. I believe so. I think that has to do with both how inequality was organized, but also, Cesar, I think it is important to understand the type of politics that were allowed in those regions. When we think about mestizaje, for the most part, we think about an ethno-racial representation, but we also forget that mestizaje was done as a way to frame politics in terms of class, right? So many of the struggles that happened in the Andean regions in Colombia were framed as class struggles between mestizos, basically. And as you know, all the struggles between the small holders of land and the big holders of land happen in this key. And I believe, many of the processes of, land redistribution, or the persistence of sort of small chunks of small holders, sort of resisting the expansion of the big capital, happen in places like this, because the coffee economy created both a new economic framework, but also a new way of organizing, politically. That didn't happen in the Pacific Coast. Hacendados were not there. The type of peasant politics of the Chinese kind or any other were not possible there. So many of these things persisted in the absence of both a new labor regime, but also a new kind of politicization of class-based categories.
Thank you. My colleague, Professor Cesar Ayala in sociology, asks, did the process of peasantization of the Afrodescendiente communities in the Pacific Chocó region begin all of a sudden with emancipation, in Jamaica, for example, or gradually as a result of the involution of the mining economy?
Yes, I think is the second one, Cesar. As the mining economy was declining, it never disappeared, but as it was declining, we have an emerging process of peasantization. It doesn't happen immediately in 1851, but it happened sort of from even earlier periods to very much the 20th century. Those type of processes were happening in many regions of the Americas. The Mississippi Delta, for instance, was one of those spaces. And your friend Juan Justi talks about the comparison between Mississippi and Loiza, am I mispronouncing that place in Puerto Rico? What is interesting of the Pacific Coast in comparative perspective is that these freedom spaces, these spaces of autonomous organization of Black peasants, that was not interrupted. As you know, from being an expert on the Caribbean, these free moments of autonomy organization were interrupted with the expansion of export economies in the late part of the 19th century and early 20th century. In Colombia, because the state was giving these territories to Catholic missions, the autonomy and the autonomous process of organization persisted. So not only initiated, but also persisted. And that was crucial to understand why Black culture and Black organizations emerged as something different from what was happening in the Andean country, for instance.
Thank you. Our colleague, Professor Peter Reich in the UCLA School of Law, also congratulates you, Juan. Thank you for your excellent presentation. You have concentrated on spatial distinctions based on race using a national scale. Are these distinctions reproduced on a more local level, i.e. within specific provinces and municipalities? Are sectors where Afro-Colombianos live treated differentially regarding political representation, access to services, treatment by the judicial system, etc.?
Definitely. Yes. Very good question. So for the most part, I focus on sort of the rural areas. I was trying to develop this thesis on racialization and rurality. But when we take a look at what is happening in cities and many of these places, many of these processes of recurrent exploitation, segregation, and so on and so forth, expel many of the young generations to nearby cities. So places like Cali or places like Medellin that are two of the closest urban centers from the Pacific Coast experience a lot of migration from the Pacific Coast to the Andean region. And that is, of course, a topic for a different talk. But in places like Cali, there is an urban segregation that is happening during the 20th century. So we can actually draw the line in a highway, for instance, where the majority of Black people live versus other places where the population is more heterogeneous. And of course, these places are not only poor in terms of wealth, but also lack of access to health, education, public infrastructure. The land is cheaper, closer to rivers, become flooded, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So many of these sort of long-term processes that I'm describing here would have later in the 20th century repercussions for how people are perceived in cities as they continue migrating from regions like this to the growing urban centers.
Thank you, Juan David. Jessica. Jessica Huerta. Hi, Juan, excellent discussion. You mentioned textbooks. Did you find that there were scientific racial projects, quote unquote, like we've seen in the US, where scientists try to justify white superiority based on different sizes of skulls, hands, and bodies?
Yes, great question, Jessica. That is actually part of my dissertation because I'm trying to trace how categories that were for the most part absent in places like the census, and this is also, one of the puzzling things of racial inequality in Latin America, that this type of racial categorization didn't make it to the census, but they did make it into other sort of infrastructures like textbooks. So you made reference to eugenics and these scientific forms of racism. And the translation from these type of intellectual scientific discourses to textbooks is also different depending on context. I don't want to extend too much on this, but I would say in places like Mexico, for instance, positivism, basically the belief in science, became an institution, became an ideology of the state. With revolution, then the eugenistic movement was sort of heavily repressed and antagonized, and that's why we have people like Vasconcelos moving away from that type of eugenistic process. So many of those things didn't make it to the textbooks in places like Mexico. In Colombia, we didn't have that sort of reversal, and the scientific sort of representation of race became dominant. In Colombia, we didn't have a revolution during the 20th century. So many of those representations didn't make it into the textbook in the 20th centuries in ways that were not institutionalized in places like Mexico.
Thank you. Matthias has another question. The fact that economic poverty is concentrated in areas that were first populated by slaves and then abandoned by a state that followed capitalist extraction wouldn't favor a Marxistish explanation of racial inequality in Colombia? By contrast, to what extent the racialized representation of mostly Black regions had an actual effect on long-term inequality?
Yes and no, Matthias, I would say. Of course, you know, the concentration of inequality and the territorial concentration of colonial institutions, of course, would favor a category-less reproduction of racial inequality. And although that might be the case, I think you know, going with and also against the Marxist interpretation, it is important, I believe, to understand what happened to a peasant that just experienced these forms of territorialized inequalities that are not doubled symbolically with a racializing language. I believe that is different from other kinds of, you know, experiences like the one that is you know, lived in the Pacific coast, with this category-less experience of segregation is then racialized symbolically. I believe it is interesting to show that Black rurality as an expression of territorial legacies of colonial institution might be distinct from mestizos or other kinds of territorial exclusion.
Thank you. There was another question from Cesar Castillo. I'm going to read it since we have a little bit of time. Cesar wrote, how do you compare racial inequality in the Pacific versus the Caribbean, where Black people are an important minority, about 20%, I think?
Yeah, that is a good question, Cesar. I believe the dynamics are different. You know, contrary to what some people might argue, I believe many of these state infrastructures did arrive in the Caribbean. That, of course, produced a lot of segregation, but more in the urban areas than in the rural ones. And you can see, you know, places like Cartagena, for instance, where if you go to La Popa, you see, you know, what I'm talking about. So I'm not trying to suggest that there's less racial inequality in places like the Caribbean, but I do believe that inequality is more concentrated in urban places and in urban dynamics. The kind of mestizaje that happened in the Caribbean very much connected both nationally and internationally with different ways of migration and so on and so forth, didn't happen in the Pacific coast. Or if that happened, then, you know, the white elite, for instance, flew away from Quito earlier. Something that didn't happen in Cartagena or, you know, in the Caribbean. So I do believe there are two different forms of racial inequality going on between the coasts.
Thank you, Juan David. We have another question, commentary from Professor Laura Gomez. The contrast between Latin American racism and US racism is, of course, an enduring one in sociology. In my own work, Manifest Destinies, the making of the Mexican-American race, I argue that it is overblown in the following way. For African Americans in the US, there has been more variation than the conventional story of the US segregation suggests, i.e. Louisiana's distinction between Black and people of color prior to 1900. More significantly, we can look at the complex trajectories of racial subordination of non-Black groups in the US, indigenous peoples, Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans, Asian Americans in the pre-1960 period. Rarely did these groups face the jure segregation, but each faced institutionalized racial subordination. So in the US, I would argue that there have been multiple forms of racialization, not just the de jure segregation, anti-Black racism that has left a continuing legacy today. So your reaction, that's of course a very strong and at the same time nuanced comment. Juan David, what's your response?
So that is a point well taken. One of the issues with comparison is that we have to draw the line at some point. And of course, there's a lot of, artificial, generalizations that we have to make as a heuristic device. So of course, I totally agree with you that characterizing the US as a place with only de jure forms of segregation is an over extension of the argument. I still use it as a heuristic form to show if we compare just sort of the places where de jure forms of segregation happened. I'm thinking about Chicago, for instance, or even LA. That still offer as a heuristic device a comparative angle that I think in general is lacking in many of the studies. So of course I totally buy your comment suggestions of not overgeneralize what is going on in the US, but I still use it as a heuristic device.
Thank you, Juan David. And we have another question from Professor Ayala. Some analysts want to deal with racial inequality in Colombia with a one-size-fits-all approach. Paschal, I think he's referring to our colleague Tiana Paschal up in the Bay Area at UC Berkeley. And apparently he wants you to put the gloves on now. Do you believe we have to treat inequality in the Pacific and in the Caribbean with raizales and palenqueros, each in its own way, each with its own dynamic?
Yes, good question, Cesar. I think that has to do that is an empirical phenomenon, I believe, that we need to approach not as an analytical preference, but as an empirical reality, if you want. So as you can tell by the history of the territorial control of the Colombian state, the state is fragmented, and the territory was given to many intermediaries, and we have intermittent, present and then abandonment of the state in different regions. If we don't understand how those regionalized forms of inequality happened, racialized or not, it's really difficult to address, both from the public policy point of view, but also from the political organization stance, how to address those inequalities. So I believe, if we pay attention to what is going on in Colombia and the fragmentation of state infrastructure and markets, is really hard. It's really hard to generalize a single logic or single dynamic of segregation and exclusion that is affecting people of African descent.
Thank you, Juan David. Thank you, everybody, for your excellent questions and comments. We're at the top of the hour, and I'm going to thank you, Juan David, one more time. As always, you're now a frequent visitor, a frequent presenter. I want to thank, of course, the Assistant Director of the Latin American Institute, Brian Pitts, who's always supporting us here with the technical stuff. Today, we couldn't transmit via Facebook Live because Facebook is down, as you know. However, we're going to post this talk later on our Facebook channel or page, but we are transmitting this via YouTube, so you can always come back, watch this presentation again, and then take the quiz. Of course, I'm kidding. There's no quiz. So thank you again. I'm very happy to have this presentation as sort of the inaugural presentation of our year-long series on Colombia at the UCLA Latin American Institute. As always, I rattle the tin can to invite you to contribute, to donate to the UCLA Latin American Institute and to its mission. Thank you again, and stay tuned. Come back here at the very least in 2 weeks, if not earlier, because we actually continue with this series, and we're going to have a presentation by Lady Diosa Jimenez on the development of political rights for Colombian immigrants and the relationship between them and the Colombian state. Thank you very much.